Good morning and good evening, everyone. I think our audience is joining us from the waiting room, so we're going to get started in just a minute or two. We're going to give people time to connect. But in the meantime, my name is Courtney Weatherby. I'm the Deputy Director and Research Analyst for the Southeast Asia Program at the Stimson Center. And I just wanted to run through a few brief logistics before I turn things over to Bill for the panel. So we hope to have an interactive discussion with the audience today. So after our commentators finish talking about security views from the Philippines, we're going to have an open Q&A with the audience. So if at any point during today's conversation you have a question or a comment that you'd like to share, please drop them into the Q&A box. I'll be watching, I'll be answering any technical issues that arise, and then I will pull from the Q&A for the open session at the end of the discussion today. So we're going to give people just another minute to get connected, and then Bill's going to kick things off. And I think the immediate rush of attendees joining from the waiting room has finished. So we'll probably still get a few more people. But Bill, if you want to go ahead and get things started with the discussion, I think we're all set.
Thank you, Courtney. Well, again, good morning, everyone on the U.S. East Coast, and good evening to our audience in the Philippines and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. And welcome to the Southeast Asia Forum's Philippines Roundtable. I'm Bill Wise. I chair the Roundtable and the Southeast Asia Forum at Stimson. Our forum is a project of the Southeast Asia program at Stimson. Our mission is to promote the study of Southeast Asia and U.S. Southeast Asia relations at colleges, universities, and research institutions in the Mid-Atlantic region of the U.S. and obviously far beyond. The Philippines Roundtable is a policy research discussion group sponsored by the Southeast Asia Forum in partnership with the U.S. Philippines Society. We're hosted by the Stimson Center, but we're entirely self-supporting, so we're very grateful to Henry Howard, member of our advisory council, and to anonymous donors for supporting our twice-monthly seminars. You can assist our work by donating at the Southeast Asia Forum web pages at the Stimson website. Well, we've got a great seminar for you today, but before we begin, I want to take just a moment to recognize the life and contributions of former President of the Philippines, Benigno S. Aquino III. Noynoy passed away on June 24th at the age of 61. He was the 15th President of the Philippines, a man of honor and vision, a strategic thinker who initiated some of the national security policies that we'll be discussing today. Our condolences go out to his family. Our topic for this seminar is Looking South, Looking West, Manila Views Security Threats to the Philippines. We'll be examining how Philippine policymakers in Manila, that is the Duterte administration, elite opinion influencers in Manila, those leaders who are not part of the administration, and elites and ordinary Filipinos in the South think about traditional security threats to the nation. And by traditional, I mean foreign military threats, coercive diplomacy, armed insurgency, and rebellion from within. The Philippines also faces myriad non-traditional security threats, natural disasters, the effects of climate change, and so forth. We'll tackle these non-traditional security threats again in the fall. Today, we'll explore the differences in Filipinos' perceptions of these traditional threats and how to counter. In the next 50 to 55 minutes, we'll look at defense policy, military preparedness, counterinsurgency, the role of allies in meeting traditional threats, and like issues. To illuminate the issues surrounding traditional threats to the Philippines, Philippine national security policy, and the state of the U.S. Philippine alliance, we're joined by two highly regarded experts. Ann Baggio is Senior Defense Analyst at the Office for Strategic Studies and Strategic Management in the Armed Forces of the Philippines. She is also involved in strategic planning initiatives and in operational assessments of the AFP. She deployed to Marawi during the crisis there, to Mindanao to study the decommissioning of the MILF, and to Zulu to observe counter-terrorist operations. Greg Poling is a senior fellow for Southeast Asia and director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He oversees research on U.S. foreign policy in the Asia Pacific with a particular focus on the maritime domain and the countries of Southeast Asia. He's one of the foremost experts, as a matter of fact, on the South China Sea disputes. So, Anne, let's start with internal security challenges in the Philippines. Give us an overview of this particular problem.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Wise. And good morning to our viewers in Washington, D.C., and good evening or good afternoon to those who are in other parts of the world. Today, I'm going to talk about internal security in the Philippines, particularly the situation in Mindanao. But before all that, I would like to drive out a point that when we talk about internal security, we are not just talking about Muslim insurgency. Internal security is very complex. We are dealing with a lot of threat groups, which includes communist insurgents and terrorist groups. In fact, communist insurgency has the highest level of security threat because they are spread all throughout the Philippines comparatively to Muslim insurgency and terrorism, which are contained in certain parts of Mindanao. However, my discussion will only focus on the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao, because it is currently the major and immediate security concern for us today. So the COVID pandemic has greatly affected and delayed the execution and synchronization of both the normalization and political tracks of the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro. So the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, which is the interim government, they were tasked to implement the tenets of the peace agreement before the upcoming 2022 national elections. Firstly, on the normalization track, they were successful in completing phase 2 of decommissioning 12,000 Bangsamoro Islamic Armed Forces, which is the armed wing of the MILF. Unfortunately, and the bad news is there's still 70% of them left, and 38,000 MILF combatants are yet to be decommissioned in a year. So there are also disagreements with the number of firearms to be surrendered. So for us, the armed forces of the Philippines, it is just logical that the number of firearms surrendered should be equivalent to the number of combatants. However, the rebel group only accounted 7,000 MILF-owned firearms, and they cannot commit those that are privately owned by their members. And the reasons why most of the Mujahideens are hesitant to surrender their firearms are because of a loss of sense of agency and fear of their own security. So the Philippine government activated the Joint Peace and Security Teams, which are composed of AFP, Philippine National Police, MILF. They are tasked to maintain the peace and security within mutually agreed areas in Mindanao. Second, another challenge brought about the COVID pandemic is the prioritization of funding for BARM. So Philippine government has to realign its budget for public health safety measures against COVID and provide financial support to the public. So this caused some delays in providing some socio-economic benefits for the MILF decommissioned combatants, which is part of the normalization program. And each rebel should have received at least support amounting to 1 million pesos, which ranges from housing, livelihood, health, etc. And further delaying these benefits might cause or incite discontent among the rebels. Third, on the political track, many remain skeptic on the success of the interim government to reach its goals by 2022. So the MILF are currently facing challenges in terms of comprehending the context and the transition or transfer of power from the previous autonomous government, which is ARMM, to now BARM. And they are still trying to learn the ropes, from former rebels to rulers. They are still trying to comprehend. They are now realizing the complexity of the bureaucracy and the issues of professionalizing institutions. They needed to hire government workers to implement their programs, but that, the pandemic also made that challenging for them. Lastly, to avoid the mistakes of the Moro National Liberation Front, which is another rebel group who was the majority party during the ARMM, the MILF's initiatives should be felt, by the people, and they should develop mechanisms for good governance and transparency under fiscal autonomy, and this would help them lure more people to vote for them in the upcoming elections and not be usurped by the parochial politicians. So BARM filed a bill to Congress to extend the transition period to 2025. This will give them more leeway and time to implement most of their programs. And President Duterte is very supportive of the Bangsamoro peace process. He prioritized the passing of the Bangsamoro Organic Law in 2018, and he recently visited Maguindanao in May and spoke to the Bangsamoro leaders to support, the peaceful gains of BARMs. The BTA is very positive that they will be able to, that the bicameral committee will approve the extension of the transition period. But of course, there are those who oppose, particularly local politicians who highlight the inadequate performance of the BTA and that enough time was given to them for the transition. But overall, despite that, the Philippine government should still be wary of both, the horizontal and vertical drivers of conflict in Mindanao. So horizontal would be the intragroup dynamics between Moro National Liberation Front, MILF, private armed groups, terrorist groups, corridos, etc. And vertical driver of conflict, which is the possible resurgence of Muslim rebellion and relapse of violence and conflict, if the MILF or BARM will not succeed.
Thank you very much. You have given us a lot to think about in a brief time. We'll pursue some of these problems that you have highlighted, but to mix it up a little bit, I'd now like to ask Greg to talk about external threats to the Philippines, in particular the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, if you prefer, or perhaps depending on what shore you're standing on. This is probably the most serious challenge to the Philippines from external sources. Can you briefly summarize the problem, Greg, and tell us where it stands today?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And at the top, thanks to Stimson and U.S. Philippines Society. It's great to share a virtual stage again with Anne, too. I think it's the second time in a month. So, really, the Philippines faces only one clear external threat. So when we talk about external threat, and in the context of U.S.-Philippine alliance, we talk about mutual defense, we're just talking about the potential violence from China in the West Philippine Sea, which is the Philippines' claim portion of the South China Sea. Over the course of the Duterte presidency, what's become clear is that the primary way that China is pursuing its interests vis-a-vis the Philippines and all the other claimants is below the threshold for military conflict. China built its massive artificial islands, which grabbed global attention and dominated the foreign policy thinking of the previous Aquino administration. But that buildup basically finished by 2016, and the militarization on those islands was basically done by the end of 2017. So for most of the last 5 years, it's been this much lower level, easier to ignore process of squeezing Filipino and other Southeast Asian civilians out of their own waters, tightening the noose on Filipino fishers at Scarborough Shoal and Filipino fishers from Palawan who operate in the Spratlys, continuing to make it impossible for Philippine oil and gas operators to access resources at Reed Bank, continuing to patrol daily around the Sierra Madre, which is the Philippines ship that houses about a dozen Marines on Ayungin or Second Thomas Shoal, and just kind of making life hard, harassing constantly Philippine resupply missions, those that come in and out of T2 or Pagasa Island in particular. The reefs around Pagasa have now been completely closed to Philippine fishing for at least the last 2.5 years, but never presenting a casus belli, right? The Chinese haven't killed anybody. They came pretty close 2 years ago when a Chinese likely militia vessel ran and sunk the Jembe, a Philippine fishing boat at Reed Bank. But luckily, those mariners were saved by passing Vietnamese fishermen. So to date, there's never been a loss of life that would grab front page attention and keep it there. You know, if to link to Anne's presentation, when we think about recent events in the South, the Mamasapano massacre, and the way it became the lodestone around the neck of the Aquino government for the last year of his presidency because of the loss of life. That hasn't happened. And so the Duterte presidency has been able to go on with what is really an unpopular foreign policy in every public opinion poll, and clearly unpopular with the armed forces and the Coast Guard and most other political elites in Manila, but it's never been a primary issue. It doesn't affect the way people vote. It doesn't affect the president's popularity. People can simultaneously say, I hate the president's foreign policy and I love the president. And as long as China keeps it below that threshold, that's okay. The problem for the rest of the Duterte presidency, and presumably for his successor, becomes that the Philippines seems to be reaching a breaking point. I mean, as we've seen with the increasing size and deployments of the Chinese maritime militia, we're rapidly approaching a point at which Filipinos simply cannot operate in the South China Sea. And there might never come that breaking point, that singular event that focuses attention. It might just be that Filipinos turn around one day and realize we've lost our exclusive economic zone and our continental shelf. It is probably already too late, for instance, to drill for oil and gas at Reed Bank. The development timeline for any project will extend now beyond the end of the Malampaya gas field that provides a significant portion of electricity for Luzon. So it's unclear that you could ever get that. And that happened without anybody ever saying it. Nobody ever agreed that we're giving up Reed Bank, but the Philippines probably has by default. The same is going to be true of fish stocks, which are collapsing, and fishermen are just moving into other ways of life anyway because they have to. Over the last few months, we have seen an attempt by, I think, certain elites, both within the Philippine security establishment and in the press and the opposition, to try to refocus attention. This started with the Whitsun Reef deployment in February and March, although it was telling that deployment had been going on for over a year. So somebody in the West Philippine Sea Task Force in Malacanang decided to make it an issue in March, not because things changed in March, but because they decided that now is the time to move. And that has resulted in an increased focus on the South China Sea. There's been a huge increase in AFP and Coast Guard patrols around the disputed reef of the South China Sea. It remains to be seen, though, whether that will have an impact on the upcoming election, whether or not it will change President Duterte's policies or the successor. Clearly, the opposition, which is trying to coalesce into this one Sambayan organization, includes both Liberal Party and Magdalo members who have long talked about the South China Sea. But I'm not convinced that this actually becomes a huge issue. And all wrapped up in this, that we can talk about in the Q&A, of course, is President Duterte's positions vis-a-vis China and the U.S., which have colored his South China Sea policy. But the bottom line is China's doing a pretty good job of stealing Philippine resources and rights inch by inch without ever presenting a critical mass of Filipinos with a reason to get angry.
That is a really interesting analysis, Greg, and your mention of the AFP explains in some part why we wanted to bring the question, the internal security question of Mindanao, together with the external question of the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea. The reason being, they're not only aspects of Philippine national security policy, but in both cases, the government relies on the AFP, a historically under-resourced organization, to respond to threats to the country. So I wanted to ask Anne, in particular, how well prepared is the AFP to deal with internal security threats? How much deployment is there in Mindanao? How is the focus on internal security affecting the organization?
Yes, thank you, Professor Weiss. I've been involved with the capability planning of the Philippine Army since 2013, and all throughout these years, although we are focusing and most of our budget are focused on internal security operations, we are still preparing and planning for external defense. And that basically covers all are probable of multi-role, multi-function organization, covering all mission areas, addressing all forms of threats, and building up a credible defense force, in the Philippines. So recently, like in 2019, after the Marawi crisis, there was, of course, an increase of military units deployed down in the southern Philippines just to contain the rest of the terrorist activities going down south. So right now, the primary focus is actually the terrorism activities in Sulu. So it has exponentially increased. They added another infantry division in that area. They added brigades and battalions, just so to uh, just to add up to the counterterrorism and counter-violent extremism efforts of Mindanao. More so in Maguindanao recently because of the transition government is about to end by 2022, and we wanted to manage whatever probable violence or conflict that may arise if BARM will not succeed.
That's quite interesting. Now, Greg, the same question to you about the strengths and weaknesses of the AFP in countering Chinese harassment and intimidation and operations in the South China Sea. But before I get to that, I want to ask you about the diversity, such diversity as there may exist in the Philippines on the question, in opinion, diversity of opinion, on the question of responding militarily to the situation in the South China Sea. Is there a space between the Duterte administration, the Manila elite, and people who live in the South as far as the South China Sea is concerned?
Well, I mean, the public opinion polling suggests not a lot. I mean, yes, numbers are a little lower in Mindanao when you ask how you feel about the U.S. They're a little higher how you feel about China. They're a little lower on is the West Philippines Sea issue an external threat. But it's a difference between 80% and 90%. I mean, I think this has become mainly kind of a cultural touchstone in the Philippines. You ask somebody, what do you think about the West Philippine Sea? And they shake their fist about China and they say that it's ours and so on. But it doesn't animate anybody to vote. It's not, it's like asking an American how they feel about Tibet. Like in the back of their mind, probably somewhere, they've got this idea, but it's not determining their choice of president. And the only places that's really different are when you talk to stakeholders directly involved, right? Fishermen in Masinloc and Luzon or in Palawan, members of the Manila elite who've actually kind of lived and breathed the policy world here. And of course, the Philippine Navy and Coast Guard. I don't even think it matters that much to the Philippine Army most of the time. When I, 2 years ago, or however long it's been now, amid COVID, last time I got to go down and do some presentations on these issues in Davao and Cebu. I mean, one of the things that struck me is how different the conversation became even among nominally kind of policy elites, those interested in international relations. It was like it was happening a world away. When you're in Davao and you're talking about Scarborough Shoal, you might as well be talking about nuclear issues in North Korea. It's something they read about in the papers, but it's not animating anybody day to day.
Interesting point, and it's something that I wanted to get on the table because it does affect both politics and governance, as well as the ability of the government to respond to events that occur vis-a-vis China or the South China Sea. So flipping back to that question, how well prepared is the AFP to deal with with countering Chinese assertiveness? What are the resource capabilities or limitations, personnel and training issues? What is your assessment of the problem that having an external threat poses for the AFP?
Yeah, this could be a whole nother conversation, I suppose, ticking off a list. So there's maybe two major problems for the AFP. One is simple capability gaps, right? I mean, if we're talking about the ability to confront the Chinese Navy or the Chinese Coast Guard, the AFP, like everybody in Southeast Asia, is hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. And the current AFP modernization plan, the 15-year plan stretching back to the Aquino government, has done some work at shifting toward external defense, but mostly what it's done is given some more capabilities to patrol, to show the flag. Nobody's under any illusions that, you know, the new Jose Rizal classes from Korea are going to last more than 30 seconds in a fight with the Chinese. That's not what they were built to or purchased to do. The problem with the Philippine procurement, like with many regional governments, is you know, people make their careers on the big flashy stuff, and so you want to buy subs, as we're hearing the conversation now. You want to buy, you know, fighter jets, and so you buy F-50s from the Koreans, and then you use it for ground attack in Mindanao, even though that's not what it was purchased for. Nobody wants to buy more remote sensing data and small patrol ships and long-range patrol aircraft, the kind of things you actually need to keep an eye on the Chinese and maintain some presence in a world which you know that you can't actually win the fight. And so that's one big problem. The other problem is the you know, the disconnect between China's gray zone strategy and traditional military planning. So if China's doing most of this with a maritime militia and with a Coast Guard, and the Philippines is responding by purchasing missile frigates and subs and combat aircraft, then they're preparing for a fight that China doesn't actually intend to have. China is going to win this thing well below the level of military conflict. And where the Philippines isn't investing, and this is true for all of us, including the U.S., is in the Coast Guard. So for the last few months, in response to the Whitson Reef incident, what we've seen is the Philippine Coast Guard, as I said, hugely increase patrol frequency and the length of patrols around Scarborough and the Spratlys, but the Philippine Coast Guard's only got half a dozen boats that can actually operate in the Spratlys. And so the wear and tear, the effect on readiness is enormous. And China has 3 naval bases sitting in the middle of the Spratlys. China can be at Reed Bank. They're 20 miles out at Mischief Reef. If you want to deploy the Philippine Coast Guard to Reed Bank, you have to go about 500 nautical miles around Palawan from Puerto Princesa. So even if you try to compete with the Chinese below the level of military force, clearly the Chinese have all of the advantages here.
This is a really important point that we wanted to bring out in this seminar, and it leads us to ask about the value of the U.S. Philippine alliance in dealing with both internal and external security threats. So thinking first about the internal threat, and how is the actual or potential role of the U.S. as a security ally against with encountering internal security threats? How is this viewed in Manila and perhaps elsewhere?
Oh, it's very much welcome. In fact, when President Duterte sort of canceled the VFA or terminated at some point, you know, a lot of Filipinos actually booted out that decision and explained that, you know, we needed the Americans to actually help us with some of the operations down in not just in Mindanao, but also, of course, directing towards the West Philippine Sea. So we have been even during the Marawi crisis, the U.S. have been very helpful towards us, you know, supporting efforts towards our fight in Marawi. And even as of now in Sulu, they have been very active in terms of providing, you know, ISR in some of our military operations down in South.
Is there, though, a consensus between Manila in the government, Manila leaders not in the government, and leaders in the South about the role of the U.S. as a Philippine ally in helping the Philippines deal with these internal security issues?
Oh, definitely, because although there's a decrease of boots on the ground from the American forces, they are still very present in the area. So people have been very welcoming to that support that the U.S. Have been given in our military operations down south.
Yeah, good. Greg, sort of a similar question to you about the actual and potential role of the U.S. as a security ally in helping the Philippines contend with external threats. Unanimity of view. What is it that Philippine leaders and other Filipino citizens think the U.S. can contribute, and how?
I think that there's a near unanimity on the broad strokes. If you ask Philippine elites and the public in public opinion polling, do you support the U.S. alliance? Over 80% say yes. If you ask, do you support a U.S. presence in the Philippines? Over 70% say yes. And there hasn't, I mean, other than in Zamboanga, there hasn't been a U.S. presence in the Philippines for 30 years. So there is this general idea that, of course, we need the Americans. You've seen this in the responses to the current continue to threaten abrogation is unpopular. But again, not so unpopular that's actually going to change anything. On the specifics, though, when you talk to the elites in Manila and AFP who have the most experience with the alliance, there are differences of opinion. Some of them relate to the long-standing grievances with the way, in the Philippine mind, Manila has been treated as a junior partner, and so the lack of top-tier equipment transferred, the way trainings are conducted, and all of those are, in a sense, fair. I mean, some of that's also on the AFP, of course. There's a nasty tendency to not upkeep things that are transferred, and so, or not budget in after purchase costs, or the problem that the AFP spends more than any other military in the world on pensions as a hangover of the Marcos days. So all of this makes that kind of thing, the nuts and bolts of the alliance, difficult. And then at the big political level, you still have this ongoing doubt. Most recently, we hear it frequently from President Duterte, but you most recently heard it from Juan Ponce Enrile in his press conference, that the Americans aren't for real. That yes, they say all the right things, but at the end of the day, if there's an attack on Filipino forces, the U.S. will not trigger its Article 5 obligations. That could either be because they still don't believe that it covers Philippine armed forces in the West Philippine Sea, despite the fact that Mike Pompeo said it, Blinken and Austin both said it, and going all the way back, really, in 1979, Cyrus Vance said it to Juan Ponce Enrile. I've got the telegrams from the State Department proving it, but he forgot that. Or it's because you've had this ongoing debate ever since 75 that the U.S. will wiggle out because of the language about constitutional processes, and the War Powers Act and the Nixon Doctrine all mean that the U.S. has plenty of excuses for why it'll consult but not actually respond. And so there are the nuts and bolts stuff that's kind of easy to get your hands around and fix, and then there's the big political doubt that's been with us for 50 years now and isn't going away.
How significant is the recent announcement of the U.S. intention to sell F-16s to the Philippines in this whole process?
I think that the administration in Washington is looking for any excuse right now to signal that it is serious and that it understands how important the alliance is, and that the President Duterte's position the Americans are unreliable is not true. And so green lighting the potential sale of F-16s is part of that. I think you'll see them jumping on any chance to do this for at least through next February. And if the VFA is abrogated next February, they'll have to figure things out again. Now, of course, the question is whether or not the Philippines is actually going to buy F-16s. Nobody knows. They're still debating it. And as I said, I remember going to Antonio Bautista Air Base years ago and looking at the rusting hulks of the last F-5s that the Philippines had from the U.S., which were just left to sit in the field. And now you're welcome to go climb on them. So there's a lot of doubt in the U.S. about whether or not any of this makes sense for AFP modernization. But if it's what the Philippines wants, then sure, we'll sell the Philippines F-16s, I guess.
And your thoughts on how this announcement is being received in the Philippines? Is it simply the glitter of international politics, or is there an operational reality here?
We have yet to find out if it's going to push through before we could actually celebrate or boot it out.
Well, that is a definitive response, and I will take you precisely as to what you mean, that this is an answer that will be forthcoming, but not today. We have continued our discussion for about a half hour, and now I'd like to turn to our audience and to see what kind of questions we have stimulated. I note that there are almost a dozen questions already in our Q&A box. So let me ask Courtney to sort through those questions and pose them to our panelists.
Indeed, we have a range of questions. I'm going to try and combine a couple of them here and there to make sure we get through as many of them as possible. But one that I think both of you might have insights into, and which would be a useful point for the discussion to start and look at sort of bigger picture future opportunities is, we're coming up on an election in the near future in the Philippines. So among the current crop of presidentiables, who is likeliest to follow in Duterte's vein and who would be likeliest to reverse Duterte's security policies? So I'd say, this for both of you, but let's start with Anne and then go to Greg.
Again, we have yet to see what's going to happen. Actually, there's just a lot of voices, public opinion happening in terms of the future presidentiables. Manny Pacquiao is obviously showing up the leagues and going up front. And there are actually observations that he could probably get more of the mass votes if Manny Pacquiao tried to run for presidentials. Again, the Versambayan, the opposition of Duterte's party, and at the same time, of course, his daughter, Sara Duterte, is also sort of being rise up to that list of names. But again, we never know. There's a lot of things. We didn't know COVID will be happening, so we have yet to look the future of what's going to be the possible presidential elections outcome is.
We should have a graph, some sort of like likelihood of election versus your opinions, because as far as I know, there's only one candidate who's actually said that they're running, and that's Antonio Trillanes, and he said he'll only run if Leni Robredo doesn't. And so Representative Magdalo, of course, he would reverse everything that President Duterte has done, but he also has no chance of becoming president of the Philippines. So it's an academic discussion. I think Anne's right. I mean, there's this wide spectrum of people who hypothetically could run as moderates, pulling support from, or independents, both pulling support from some combination of the Duterte coalition and the One Sambayan coalition. Isko Moreno, Manny Pacquiao would be on those lists. I don't know what Isko thinks about the South China Sea. Manny Pacquiao has been tougher on the South China Sea in China, particularly lately as he seeks to separate himself from President Duterte's legacy, obviously. And so who really knows? From everything I've heard from Leni Robredo, she would tack back toward a more pro-American policy and mirror mostly the policies of the Aquino administration. And on the side of the Hukbong coalition or PDP Laban, I think by all accounts, Sara Duterte is much more pragmatic than her father and doesn't have the deep reflexive anti-Americanism that's colored his policy. So even if she is more skeptical of our alliance commitment, I think she would be a lot easier for American policymakers to work with. If it becomes a cipher of President Duterte, basically, like Bongo, then all bets are off. We're probably looking at Duterte 2.0, and the Americans are going to have to rethink whether or not the alliance can actually survive another 6 years, and if not, what American planning should look like in a post-alliance future.
All right, I think our next question is likely for Greg, but both of you could answer. So we've had a few different questions about the role of Japan in regional security. So the first question is really specifically looking at Coast Guard assistance. So Ellen Frost noted she understands that Japan's been actively assisting regional Coast Guards. Is this making a difference? And then we also had another question about, looking beyond just Coast Guard assistance, what type of support from Japan would be most effective to sort of support a regional security and a positive relationship with the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines?
Yeah, Japan's helped on the margins. Japan has assisted the Philippines as it has Vietnam and Indonesia with loans and grants of patrol vessels. In fact, the largest vessels in the Philippine Coast Guard are the two 96-meter vessels they got from Japan. They've also got some smaller 50-ish meter patrol aircraft or patrol boats. Japan lent the Philippines its first kind of maritime patrol aircraft, the TC-90s, which the Americans helped put sensors on. And Japan helped build a network of radar stations that have plugged into the National Coast Watch Center. So on the maritime patrol, maritime domain awareness front, Japan's helping quite a bit. the question for me is always whether or not Japan goes up to the next level. And there's been discussions going on between Manila and Tokyo ever since the Aquino administration about signing the Visiting Forces Agreement. Right now, only American and Australian troops have the legal right to be in the Philippines because we have SOFAs. The Japanese have been talking about becoming the third leg of that stool for many years and haven't gotten there. I think that could be a big difference maker when it comes to training and readiness. And at the highest level, the most important thing Tokyo does and has done for the whole Duterte administration is provide political cover. I mean, when Duterte famously went to Beijing in October of 2016 and announced his separation from the US, a month later he went to Tokyo and tacked back and agreed with then Prime Minister Abe that the US alliance was critical. So we probably have Tokyo to thank for the fact that there still is a US Philippine alliance right now.
All right, our next question is going to be for Anne. So one of our attendees asked, is there any difference among sub-regional internal security threats, and how are those differences influenced by the geography of the Philippines?
You mean the other armed threat groups, sub-regional threat groups?
They didn't specify threat groups, but I think they're thinking threat groups, yes.
Okay, probably maybe comparison between the communist insurgents and the Muslim insurgents. Yes, there is a difference, although in terms of the objectives of the communist insurgency of taking over all the Philippines and having a complex organizational and spheres of influence all over the Philippines. But at the same time, I think what's more critical with the Muslim insurgency, on the other hand, is that, you know, the principles of it has also some regional security aspects that if conflict arises within down south, you know, it's just a domino effect towards sending off like internally displaced peoples towards Malaysia and Indonesia. That's why some of our partners, Malaysian and Indonesian partners, are very active in terms of the Bangsamoro peace process, being members of the International Monitoring Team, which is very instrumental in terms of reducing the number of violence and conflicts throughout the years. And at the same time, they are very active and supportive of the Trilateral Cooperation Agreement. So I think that's more critical in terms of if violence have ignited down south, compared to, you know, communist insurgencies, sporadic activities all over the Philippines.
All right, this next question is addressed to Greg, although I think Anne may have thoughts on this as well. So when we're looking at the South China Sea, obviously the most controversial instances are those which involve a loss of life. Apart from an incident that involves a loss of life, what are some of the other factors or types of incidents that could influence political behavior of Filipinos in respect to foreign policy?
This is a good question. I think a lot of it comes down to signaling from Philippine elites. Under the Aquino government, people were angry because their government told them they should be angry. And under the Duterte government, people aren't sure what to make of it because every time there's an incident, their government tends to say, don't worry, we got this covered. Or as in the case of the sinking of the Jim Bear, they say it was Filipino fishermen's fault all along. It's not China's fault, so don't worry about it. So really, the election next year and the policy pursued will determine how Filipinos feel about the West Philippine Sea, I think. I mean, again, unless you end up with a loss of life, in which case it's really hard to spin dead Filipinos. And so far, the Duterte government's been very lucky that it hasn't gotten to that point, and they have been able to spin the negative events that occur.
All right, so just sort of picking up on sort of the political challenges and the political spin from elites. This question is for both presenters, but can you comment on whether the demise of former President Noynoy Aquino would have any impact on the 2020 elections or on how the issue of the South China Sea is going to be talked about in the future?
I feel like Anne's waiting for me to take the bullet on this one. God, I find it hard to think that it won't continue to be a topic of discussion throughout the election season. And obviously, One Sambayan, the Liberal Party, are going to try to use it to animate voters. There's no lack of op-eds flying off the Philippine press last week comparing this to both Noynoy's own, kind of being drafted into the presidential race in 2010 following Cory Aquino's death, and of course Cory's rise after People Power following Ninoy's death. And so I think a lot of folks in the Philippines want to draw some kind of line of fate here, that this is just what happens to Aquinos. And when it happens, then obviously it becomes a moment of national rejuvenation and the next generation steps up. Now, part of the problem is there is no next generation ready to step up. The Liberal Party is not the Liberal Party of Cory Aquino or Ninoy Aquino. And so I honestly don't know. It'll be one of many storylines that color the election, I imagine, but I don't think it's going to be determinative in any sense.
Probably my turn. I actually, this is quite difficult, but just as I perceive it in perception from others who in the public, I feel like President Noynoy's death wasn't as much of an impactful compared to those of his parents, which probably it might have affected some of the intellectual elites and those who are non-aligned to President Duterte's, but it didn't give much that of a hype as public, and practically also because it's just pretty recent that some of the negative things that happened during his administration are still pretty fresh with the public. So therefore, there's still a sense of comparison of some of the good things that he has done and some of the bad things he has done. And yeah, so then that would have been more less impactful to most of the masses, and just very relatable to those who are non-aligned, or to those who are the intellectual elites who supports the Aquino family.
Right, so we have a range of questions left and only about 10 minutes. So I'm going to stay with a few of the questions that are looking at sort of domestic situations in the Philippines and then return to the regional sphere at the end. So I think that the next question who are likely going to be targeted towards Anne. But Anne, can you talk about the status of the Marawi rehabilitation, particularly for displaced communities? Is the AFP camp expansion in Marawi currently pushing through? And the questioner notes that they're interested in this because they anticipate that the success of the rehabilitation program could help the current administration and by extension, the candidate backed by President Duterte in the future election.
Yes, it's actually very, it's a priority project of the Duterte administration, the rehabilitation in Marawi. And yes, most of the city center, the development within Marawi is already on its hype. And yes, the camp has already been successfully expanded. But I don't necessarily think it's something of a highlight right now that's being looked into. And just like what Greg said a while ago in terms of public perception towards the West Philippine Sea, there is not much of a public hype also in any internal security threats down south. There's also like a lack of information, education, and communication towards the general public. Imperial Manila versus the problems going on in down south. So I don't necessarily think it will be used by the current administration in pushing forward to whatever campaign they are going to, simply because much substantial compared to those who are up north.
And in a similar vein of sort of domestic situation, we had another question noting specifically, looking specifically at the MNLF. So since Yusak Chikuri of the EC MNLF passed away last year, how has the EC MNLF contributed to peace building in Sulu and building support for the government? How does their position contrast with that of Normisari's MNLF?
They are currently very, so there's two groups of the MNLF, the SEMA group and the Miswari group, and both of them, the SEMA group are very active in terms of supporting things that are happening within farm. but the other group is some sort of there's some rogueness happening along down south in Mindanao with them in Sulu area. So basically, the AFP is just managing, the dynamics within these groups. We really don't know what they're really thinking, because for one thing, Zamboanga crisis in 2013 was such upright. Like MNLF just attacked Zamboanga out of nowhere without having like hesitations in terms of, doing things against farms. So we haven't we don't know what that's going on in their minds, but basically right now they're very involved with whatever happenings in the south.
All right, and I'm going to transition now back to a couple of the sort of broader regional security questions. So I think both of these are likely targeted towards Greg. The first is that Austal and the Cerberus group, including DynCorp, are reportedly close to finalizing an agreement to purchase the Hanjin Heavy Industries shipyard at Subic Bay. Can you talk about the political and security implications this would have for the region?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we don't really know what the final plan is for the project, other than that the Philippine Navy's already secured some of the space for ship repair facilities. The commercial side, presumably, also is going to use it for shipbuilding, which they already do in the Philippines. We don't really know what kind or what size. So it could be really significant. It could not. But the bottom line is the most important thing about this merger was keeping it out of Chinese hands. That was the reason it happened. Clearly, when Hanjin decided to go into bankruptcy and sell, the top candidates were at least two Chinese corporations. And there was a clear outcry and effort by political elites and the AFP to find another buyer, anybody who would make sure that didn't happen. And they found Austal and Cerberus.
I think this is related but separate, which is that the Philippines has allowed the United States joint use of 5 facilities, but none of them are naval facilities. Can you talk a little bit about why not? And given that there's been ongoing conversation about potential access to assist with building the Ayungin or Oyster Bay facilities on the West Coast, is there any opportunity for access or collaboration in that space?
Yeah, so this is a reference to the 5 agreed locations under the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. So those are 1 Army base, Fort Magsaysay, and then 4 air bases. The most important being Basa and Luzon, and ABAB, Antonio Bautista Air Base in Puerto Princesa. That's not the complete list. I mean, nothing in EDCA says you only get 5 bases. Those are the first 5. And there was clearly an idea when they were negotiated, and that list was settled upon in I think 2015, we said on the list, that eventually it would be expanded. Oyster Bay has long been talked about because, as I indicated in my presentation, Puerto Princesa, where AFP Westcom is currently based, is on the wrong side of Palawan. It's too far if you're trying to go to Spratly. So you build on Oyster Bay on the other side, and it cuts by more than half the response rate. That's been a Philippine Navy project for years. And the master plan for Westcom was to move all of Westcom's Navy assets to Oyster Bay to make room for this big expansion of the air base at ABAB, which would include the U.S. EDCA site. All of that was basically canceled the day President Duterte came into office. It's all been on hold. The U.S. agreed location at ABAB was taken away, and then there was talk about where we could operate. The Puerto Princesa civilian airport got to expand at the expense of all of the Philippine Air Force's plans. And this became pretty consistent with what we saw at all of the locations. So other than having built what amounts to a gazebo at Basa Air Base, our supposed HADR storage facility, which is just, a tent. Well, it's a little better than that. It looks like where you'd have a picnic at your local park. Other than that, the U.S. has no significant access to any of the EDCA sites. And so before we talk about expansion to Oyster Bay, I think the first job is to get to the agreement we reached now 7 years ago to access these sites, none of which we have.
Right, and I think we're nearly at the end of our time, but I'm going to squeeze in one last question, which ties together some of the domestic challenges and regional security challenges that we've talked about today, which is the question of external support for and influence over armed groups in Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago. So I think this question is likely for Anne, but Greg may have thoughts as well about the degree to which we see outside support coming in for these groups, both in terms of equipment and in terms of finances and other support.
You mean of U.S. support in Mindanao?
I think this is more the idea of external financial or equipment support for the various armed groups that are active in Mindanao or in the Sulu archipelago. So not necessarily U.S. support. I think the question is more intending for other support for the armed groups, not rather than the government.
For the sorry, again, sorry, it took a while for me to.
So
I mean
I
support
think,
to the AFP.
yeah, they didn't specify which group specifically, but I think they're curious about non-government, off the books support for these armed groups.
Of the U.S.
Sorry, perhaps it's
sorry,
the lag. The question is the question is, can you talk about external support for and influence over the various armed groups that have conflict with the government in Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago?
Okay, so I don't think there's any external influence that supports the armed threat groups in the Philippines. It's just so that there are a lot of criminal activities happening along south border that allows them to amass such of capabilities in terms of developing their group. But there is not much of an information, I guess, coming from sort of a proxy influence towards armed threat groups. I don't know if I got that question correctly. I hope I answered that. It's just a bit of confusing for me.
Maybe Anne would know better than I what the current status is, but I mean, in the lead up to and after Marawi, you did see an uptick in recruitment and financing flowing to the various ISIS aligned groups in the southern Philippines. You had briefly, anyway, ISIS Central recognized finally a caliphate in the southern Philippines, which had been requested for many years, and ISIS had held off on that. My understanding is it did help with recruitment. You started seeing more coming across from Malaysia in particular, bomb makers and foreign fighters, and also flows of financing that clearly, helped the Malte Group in its effort to control Marawi, where there were networks of financing coming in from Indonesia, Malaysia, and farther afield to help support the fight.
Yes, that's it for the Marawi. But right now, the Anti-Terrorism Council has expanded, their mandate and trying to cut off, those support also for the terrorist groups down south in Mindanao.
All right, well, with that, I think we should close down the Q&A because we're about at time. So Bill, did you and Hank want to make some final closing comments?
Thank you. Thank you, Courtney. And just like to say that these issues that we've been discussing today do represent the intersection between politics and economics and security. So this story, these issues will be with us for some time to come. And the Philippines Roundtable at the Southeast Asia Forum will continue to be a platform to discuss them. We have a good program lined up for next semester. But before I go to that, let me ask our partner, Hank Hendrickson, Executive Director of the U.S Philippines Society, for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Greg and Anne, for shedding light on the threats posed, both internal and external, to the Philippines, and then linking that to the resource requirements needed going forward, and some of the factors that have been affected, that affect those requirements. COVID, you pointed out, Anne, and in a couple of ways has had a major impact. And it points out the need for cooperation internationally in addressing the COVID pandemic challenge. Greg, I thought your description of the military imbalance in the South China Sea was important in pointing to the need for other processes to come to play, to be brought into play on diplomatic channels through both bilateral U.S. Philippines security cooperation, where that will go. Certainly the requirements for adroit Philippine diplomacy with China, and then regional forums addressing Southeast Asia more broadly, South China Sea issues in particular more broadly, will be important if, in fact, the security situation is going to remain fairly constant in heavily favoring the Chinese position there. And I think your reminder was important that regional autonomy in the South is still a work in progress. That too has been impacted by the pandemic. And we look forward to seeing progress there and seeing how far that can go, because as you pointed out, it has links both to the perception of government governance and competence of the current administration in dealing with those threats, and through a political process can reduce some of the security threats there. And finally, Bill, the U.S. Philippines Society looks forward to continuing partnership with the Southeast Asia Forum in the fall in particular in addressing non-traditional threats. So it's going to be an important complement to the program that we've had today. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Hank, and thanks to our two guests, Ann Baggio and Greg Poling, for your excellent insights and analyses. Thanks to our audience for your questions. As is almost always the case, there are more questions than time, so we apologize for if we didn't get to your question, but it may be possible for us to get to you separately. So if you would like to continue the discussion, please email us at the Southeast Asia Forum and we will be in touch with our guests. Thanks again to our partners at the U.S. Philippines Society for another semester of invaluable collaboration. This is the final Southeast Asia Forum seminar for the spring semester. We'll be back in the fall, as I mentioned before, with a full slate of seminars on a wide range of Southeast Asia issues, including Philippine issues. Be sure to check our web pages on the Stimson Center website. So until September, be sure to get your shots and stay safe and well, and good day.